For anyone here who might not know who I am or who we are, my name is Evan Schmidt. I am the outreach coordinator for TallWood Design Institute, and you are tuning into our research brief series. This is the last of 6 research brief meetups that we have been hosting in lieu of our traditional in-person research symposium. TallWood Design Institute is a collaboration between 2 different universities, University of Oregon, Oregon State University, focusing on the advancement of the science of advanced timber construction and design. Our research series has been focusing on a variety of subjects. Today, I'm excited to invite some outside organizations to share their research and a few of their projects that were funded by the U.S. Forest Service Wood Innovation Grants Program. The topic of today is going to be on utilization of underutilized timber sources. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the connection between forestry and restoration work and timber sources that are traditionally not necessarily as economically viable. So we are going to hear from a couple different groups, have a couple different perspectives. It's going to be really interesting. I'm really looking forward to it. With that, I will hand it off. I do want to say, in case you're unfamiliar, that we will save questions for the end. So we'll hear all 4 presentations and then we'll open it up for a general discussion. So with that, I'm going to open the meeting here to Paul Vanderfort from Sustainable Northwest, and then we'll move on.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Evan. My name is Paul Vanderfort. Thank you very much for having me today. I work at Sustainable Northwest as the Green Markets Program Director. Sustainable Northwest is a non-for-profit that's been around a little over 25 years. We work on forestry issues as well as water, energy, and rangeland to find solutions that work for the communities, the businesses, and the resource that's being discussed. So in this instance, certainly forestry and green markets is why I think we're here. And the Wood Innovations project that I will get to here, I'm going to spend maybe about 5 or 6 minutes talking about why we landed with the partners that we did for our restoration wood project, because I think that foundation is really the reason why I'm quite hopeful that what we're after is very achievable. I've been very pleased to see kind of the conditions that have brought some of the market opportunities forward. So if you'll forgive me for a second, some of the folks on this call, maybe already know some of the things I'm going to mention in terms of trends, but if not, hopefully it's interesting. So Sustainable Northwest has been facilitating common ground, post timber wars, after litigation on forests in the Pacific Northwest for over 25 years. That work has led to us facilitating groups directly and providing support in other ways, to the point where there's now well over 20 groups in the state of Oregon and Washington. Those collaboratives are a real success story. And because of their success and because of the social license they're starting to gain, there's a very powerful story to be told for that specific restoration wood. And certainly I think sheds light on the broader conversation around what forest restoration can look like and what it can mean in terms of having benefits for all parties, even when it's being done on private land. Okay, forgive me as I'm trying to switch my slide here. Was working earlier. Forgive me. Can't seem to, well, I can just do this without the slide. So if I didn't do this in about 5 more seconds, that's what I'm going to do. All right. So in addition to facilitating forest restoration projects, the second arm of our work is really around building green markets for responsibly sourced wood in the region. And in doing so, we've built relationships with wood certification systems, with sustainable building firms. And in doing that, we've started writing wood procurement policies for pretty major firms and individual projects as well. And in doing that, we've been seeing under the hood in terms of project teams really start to want to show how their business growth or how their wood project specifically not only has less impact in terms of footprint. If you're talking about carbon, for example, in business growth, a lot of us have seen graphs that show those being in lockstep. When you are building more, there's more carbon being burned and used. And so projects and businesses are really interested in figuring out a way to separate those two things, that they could show themselves both growing as a business and building more buildings, and doing that in a way where it doesn't have negative impact. And to that shift, we are seeing people explore ways to have not only less negative, but potentially have positive impact. And I think that's where you get some really interesting nexus with restoration wood, especially as people are talking about climate change, forest resilience, intense fires that we're seeing more and more on the West Coast. You have a lot of tech firms. Those fires are in their back door, although this summer, certainly they were in all of our back doors. And then also investment in rural communities, while that is not a new subject, is certainly one that folks continue to be very interested in. And I think they see this as a way to do all three of those things. So to just underscore the shift that we're seeing. And interestingly, I think it's worth mentioning that historically people would turn to certification, wood certification, as a way to answer some of those goals. And wood certification tends to be pretty poor at these specific goals. It does not have transparency back to source forest. It doesn't deliver that story. And a lot of restoration work happens on public lands, and public lands at the federal and BLM level are not certified at this time. So you're talking about forests that tend to not line up well with the way businesses have approached wood, and particularly sustainable wood sourcing in the past. So I think the really good news, and maybe the news that folks on this call in particular are most aware of already, is that, when you're talking about mass timber, there's a real benefit that we're talking about large volumes of wood, because it's allowing the idea of partnership and working directly with mills at a scale where the mills start to show interest. And also that mass timber uniquely is much more vertically integrated than a lot of wood supply chains. And so when you are asking those questions about source forest, the answers are actually easier. You're asking a less difficult question when you're coming to a mill and asking them about source forest when we're talking about mass timber. So there's a nice kind of nexus there. So as we've worked with individual projects, what we've started to see is that people are finding ways to trace forest landscapes to their projects. We've seen that in some of the gold standard building certifications, Living Building Challenge, which I think many people would see as a very difficult standard. It's certainly not very widely applied in the US, but they have started to accept restoration wood material. They've started to accept juniper restoration. They've started accepting individual species when they're talking about restoration. And for the first time this last year, working with the PAE project in Portland, we created 9 criteria for what you could use to potentially define restoration wood. And we proceeded to get a green light from the International Living Building Challenge to explore a wood package that was restoration in origin versus something like FSC certified. So that gave us a lot of momentum and interest in what we could do with this Wood Innovations grant. And then on top of that, working with some tech firms on their wood procurement policies, we've started to see an interest particularly around fire resilience. And we've had major tech firms going to the forest with mills, doing tours and going, yeah, that's what we want. That's what we're talking about. And so we're now seeing in the last 9 months, people starting to put building preferences in that are trying to target restoration wood. So that being said, there are a handful of projects that I'm directly involved in, and certainly some projects that I'm not, that will land in the next few years. I mean, certainly mass timber projects take time, and so some of this stuff is still in the works, but I'm very excited by the next 3 to 5 years, and what we'll be able to do in terms of restoration material so that people can walk into airports, they can walk into downtowns, they can walk into major buildings made of wood and point at the wood and speak to what forest landscape it came from and what impact it had in terms of restoration, climate, fire resilience, and so forth. So I, all that said, I do want to touch on what Sustainable Northwest is hoping to do with our Wood Innovation Grant, because I definitely would like to connect with folks if they have projects or if they have ideas for how the work you're doing matches with what we're doing. We have a lot of green building firms who are putting forward projects, including SRG Partners and Swinnerton, with the OSU Bend Cascades campus and other projects where we are trying to create market value in the context of a market preference, and potentially in some of our pilots, lead points and living building challenge points, where we will be working hand in hand with the pilots to develop pathways to create documentation and authenticate the sourcing. We're not looking to duplicate third-party certification. We're not intending to have a burden of cost associated with this to the mailing infrastructure, but we are hoping to come at it from the project side of things and bring resources to do that authentication ourselves. And so we hope to have a few different pilots that explore different methods for authentication of material, some of which potentially would be fully segregated product, in other instances, something less expensive as full segregation. We are also hoping through the project to map out where the restoration material is coming from right now in the supply chains, who it's going to, and what products it's going into, so that we have a better idea when we have market partners wanting to buy restoration wood, what wood options there are and where they could target their design and their wood procurement to connect with that resource. And then the very last thing, kind of tying it back to social license and the story here, we will be creating video content, doing interviews with collaborative group partners, including some of the environmental community that see the restoration as favorable, and then creating social media posts to really bring some of this storytelling forward, both for the specific projects involved as well as a broader community of people that we're trying to influence. So you'll see the first video that we're launching with our Wood Innovation Grant come out next week on the Sustainable Northwest website, as well as our partners as they start to push out some of this content. I may have gone over here, so I'm going to stop now, but I definitely look forward to your questions if you have any.
Thanks, Paul. No, you didn't go over, don't worry.
Great.
Thank you very much. And we'll open up to Paul Jones, Paul number 2. Paul Jones, Neil Creek Forest Products. Paul's going to be talking about a Wood Innovation Grant project called Expanding Small Diameter Processing Capacity.
Thank you, Evan. So I'm the CEO of a couple different companies out of Hood River, and I'm the CEO of Weiss Timber Services, which we're a traditional logging outfit out of the Columbia Gorge. We run 3 different sides, but what kind of separates us from other outfits is we try to procure most of our own product. So we are one of the largest purchasers of timber sales of the federal level on the Mount Hood and on the Gifford Pinchot. We buy a lot of timber sales both at Hood River County, and we also do a lot of private logging. And have a trucking company, Middle Mountain Trucking, and then have a Neil Creek Forest Products. And Neil Creek Forest Products is your kind of traditional mulch, compost, bark yard. And what I found is in order to get a year-round revenue stream, and especially incorporated in logging, is we got into the small diameter processing of wood. And what I had found in my logging career is that the mills over the years, the logs are either too big, too small, too black, too crooked, and the cost of transportation to get material to the right kind of mill around the Columbia Gorge was pretty cost prohibitive sometimes. So with the Wood Innovations Grant, we at first were going to go into small diameter logs and make those into pallet stock, and then actually start creating a pallet, get into the pallet business here in Hood River. We did kind of a ROI study, And with the price of utility wood so volatile and the amount of capital that it was going to take to get kind of a pallet manufacturing business off the ground at that time, and still not at this time, it wasn't cost effective to be able to do a ground up operation on that. So what we started to do is we really got into mass firewood producing, and we were selling some of it into wholesale, kind of into the Portland area. But we have found that here in the Hood River Gorge area there is, an immense amount of people that still burn firewood here, to the point of, like, we run almost 3,000 cords a year of firewood through our operation, which is equivalent to 350 plus truckloads of logs. And most of those logs right now are sourced off of federal timber sales and also burnt timber sales. So currently right now, our yard, a couple years ago out in Dufur, they had the South Valley fire. And then just this year, they had the Fir Mountain fire here in this region. This isn't even anything that's obviously happened from kind of Highway 26 south. And so the pulp mills do not want anything whatsoever with char on them, because it's hard to make white paper with black bark. So we have found kind of this niche market to be able to bring in this material and basically make a lot of firewood out of it and be able to do it quickly and efficiency. And then with having a mulch yard, everything that comes into our yard, we're 100% sustainable. So our bark goes into our mulch products, and then we sell just a lot of the sawdust off of our firewood machine for people doing their bare root nursery stock in the spring. So everything that comes in is 100% used through our business. So where we're at now with the Wood Innovations Grant is we're really looking into biochar, and we are also looking into having some kiln capacity at our yard, and to be able to take this small wood and figure out if it's more feasible to make biochar out of it, or if we're making firewood out of it, is to start getting the wrapping process and getting into grocery stores, campgrounds, those types of operations, kind of throughout the Pacific Northwest. But our demand has been so high of just, selling a cord of firewood throughout the gorge. It's been hard to pivot off of that and kind of look at other opportunities, because currently we cannot keep up with the current demand that we have right now with the firewood that we have into our location. So the other thing that we did do is we did purchase a couple small sawmills, and the wood that was oversized or unique or doing different size of quality, there was a lot more value in to take the first 20, 30, 40 feet off the log and run that through our sawmills, whether it was post and beam or whether it was slabs, sell that, and then the rest of it went into firewood. So as of right now, we haven't got our sawmill operations into a sustainable cash flow yet, and part of that is operations, and part of it is just kind of getting the right person to run that side of the business for me, and to be able to really kind of navigate where we need. And then we've also found out that not having any kiln capacity is, when you're doing slabs and sometimes some of the high end products, that we definitely need to have some kiln capacity at our yard. So I come from it, from a lot of other different people, not so much on the conceptual side, but we're, boots on the ground, buying timber sales, logging timber sales. And then at the end of the day, that we are able to make, when we do our stewardship proposals, that we're able to come to the Forest Service or come to different landowners and say, hey, we're able to do stuff here because we're able to use all of the product out of the forest, compared to where some purchasers or where some people don't have an end market for some of the stuff. Currently, we're logging up in Mosier right now for multiple landowners that were affected from the Mosier fire. And again, one of the reasons why we have the job up there is because we are able to take this black wood and we are able to use it into our supply stream and be able to both merchandise the logs to go to the general mills here, and then whatever is not used, bring it into our yard. And the average small landowner, doesn't realize, they always come back and say, oh, I want a truckload of firewood logs left over for me because I burned firewood. And they never have kind of the full capacity of what it takes to cut 2 or 3 cords of firewood a year. So that's where we're kind of out with our Wood Innovations grant. We have been very successful with it because we basically went from we've had 2 of them now. Our first one was from concept all the way through a profitable business within the first couple of years. And the second go around is to look at the biochar side of the business. And that technology is coming on more and more. And, that's the one thing that we don't have a 100% solution for in the forest is, I was out burning 41 piles today across the landscape. And if those piles feasibly could be put into a biochar machine and making biochar, having a trucking company, a lot of times it comes down to the logistics of that. And so those are the things that we're going to be researching with our grant this year.
Is that you done?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you, Paul. All right. We're going to move on to Nick Wahbrook from Blue Forest Conservation. Nick, if you're ready.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the chance to share a little bit about who Blue Forest is. My name is Nick Wahbrook. I'm a co-founder of Blue Forest Conservation. We're 9 people, include some foresters, a lot of hydrologist modelers, as well as some finance folks. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. In other words, we're a nonprofit, and we're primarily based in California, but with projects under development in Southern Oregon and Washington State. And what we've been working on, and I'll share a little bit about what the WIG is supporting us to do, is to help drive capital and investment in restoration of our public lands, primarily. Opportunities for private lands could exist, but we primarily work with the Forest Service to identify some of the co-benefits that could result if NEPA permitted projects were to be implemented. And actually, thanks to a lot of the great work that Sustainable Northwest has done with establishing forest collaborative groups, that social license towards permittable and executable projects exists, and we're trying to help bring resources to that enormous planning effort that is advancing. I will quickly go through. In California, some of the landscape we're looking at has changed dramatically, as you all know, because of fire exclusion. So preaching to the choir, I imagine. And as well with climate change, those stresses are creating just enormous fires in California, Oregon and Washington, Colorado, Montana, elsewhere, with enormous devastation in property losses, as well as air quality, carbon emissions, impairment of water resources, health costs for folks, tourism and recreation at risk. So there's a lot of not just co-benefits of restoration, but a lot of costs associated, as you all know, with these large and devastating, tragic fires, really, not just to the ecosystems, but to the communities as well. And in many states, Oregon being one of them, there's nearly 1 million acres of NEPA permitted projects. And California and Washington State have quite a bit of shelf stock of projects as well. Blue Forest works to try and bring dollars to projects in part based on the co-benefits that would result from that restoration work. Because the Forest Service keeps spending more money fighting fires, and they've had relatively flat budgets over the last decade, there are far less resources available for the Forest Service itself to fund some of the proactive restoration work that would reduce wildfire risk. Why it's relevant to be at the TallWood Design Institute talk right now is to discuss additional co-benefits and value that can be created from restoration work can only help make these projects pencil out, whether that's cross-laminated timber, uses of biochar, other uses of forest biomass, in addition to the very valid economic reasons, such as forest health, recreation, jobs, water quantity and quality, that can help justify the economics for restoration work. So how Blue Forest looks to make investment in NEPA permitted landscape scale projects possible, and to connect investor money in the form of pension funds, foundations, university endowments, insurance companies, sort of low interest rate seeking lender capital, to ecosystem service projects on the left. Blue Forest with partners like the World Resource Institute and some academic groups and hopefully more partners that might be on this call too, does three main activities to connect that capital resource to good projects on the left. We help model and evaluate what the ecosystem benefits are likely to be from if a project were to be implemented. We also look at the models of the existing risk if the project were not to be implemented. So part of the economic cost analysis is not just looking at the ecosystem services that come from the project, but also what is the delta, or what is the change, or the ecological uplift. All of those are sort of the same way to describe the different ways to describe the same thing. What is the improvement that is likely to be seen from a project? And that is both in avoiding cost as well as potentially enhancing revenue for different parties. So avoiding costs, if we think about operations for utilities, if we think about property and casualty insurance to losses to insurance companies, if we think about maintenance costs for departments of transportation and counties, think about lost tax base and revenue, if we think about suppression costs for some parties too. Many of these have big estimated wide bands and not the most precise confidence intervals, although some of these outcomes can be measured with some precision. So we look at what the economic avoided and enhanced avoided costs and enhanced revenue opportunities, as well as the compliance targets potentially for things like TMDLs, which are applied to water bodies that could result from the negative impacts of fire. We then identify who those beneficiaries where it impacts their bottom line if the project were implemented, and we develop contracts and agreements, which we're now building off of just our first project that's already being implemented, for those parties to make payments or reimbursements if the projects were to be implemented. And even the opportunity exists if certain measured outcomes are achieved and measured, payments can be based on that. Think about carbon and paying for carbon after the fact rather than having to estimate and model what that carbon would be prior to the fact. Think about water quality measurements and thinking about that. That's something that's quite easily to measure with some respect. We then develop a financial vehicle that allows a high amount of certainty to the lending investors that allows them to make that investment and expect a hard-earned 2 to 4% rate of return. So this is clearly not the most financially lucrative position, although if we can lower the risk of investors receiving a positive return with a high amount of certainty, that actually is a pretty good rate of return right now if you think about what one might get in a bank account. In today's economic environment, a solid positive financial return and a return of capital is something that's quite worth it. So lending investors, how all this works, lending investors put money into a project financing vehicle that Blue Forest establishes that funds work on the ground through implementation partners that can be counties, can be tribes, can be other environmental nonprofits, or any entity that has authority to do work on Forest Service land, often through a master stewardship agreement or other cooperative agreement. That really lets those entities let contracts out to bid so contractors can apply to do that restoration work. One advantage in this mechanism is that the money is available up front to pay contractors within 30 days or less, rather than waiting for reimbursements and processing from the state or other granting entities. As work is accomplished on the ground, beneficiaries such as utilities make payments back to the investment vehicle, which simply passes that money back to the lending investors. This is really a mechanism to try and blend different sources of capital that ultimately would like to see a project occur, but each source of capital has their own different strings attached. So the Forest Service has authorities that make cost sharing a requirement. Contributions have to be made within the same year or two when projects are completed, and budgets and fiscal schedules are quite rigid compared to the flexibility that water agencies, insurance companies, and other local beneficiaries may be able to pay back over time. Think of all of this as really just infrastructure financing, like we've done for a century for infrastructure like water pipes and pumps and water treatment plants. But instead, that infrastructure financing is to our natural infrastructure, and we're accepting payments from multiple sources. We'll keep going in interest of time. So part of what Blue Forest has done with our WIG, we're expanding from a very first project that's a $4 million investment in the Tahoe National Forest. We're now expanding to a project. Here's some of the wildfire modeling we're doing. Expanding to a project that's about twice the size, but going to be about $15 million of investment called the Trapper Project in the same Tahoe National Forest Yuba Ranger District. Payments are coming from the Yuba Water Agency, as well as the state of California, as well as the Forest Service. Part of what the Blue Forest does is help to estimate and monetize what some of the ecosystem values are. Now, this mechanism, this graphic here probably makes very little sense to most, but with a little bit of description, it might help. It's a correlation between satellite measured greenness in an index called NDVI and how much water the forest is transpiring. And this is a pretty tight correlation of 0.883 for a natural system. This is one of the mechanisms when we apply this correlation through, which was really developed from some of our science partners, to a landscape over time. And you can see the different years of this down below. How green the forest is a good lagging indicator for how much water the forest has been transpiring. And this is a measure of evapotranspiration from the forest each year. Within the red areas where a fire had occurred, and you can see it dip and then it recovers with some quick revegetation, that's shrubs and things, and then it dies back. And this is a pretty good metric for how water balances can be used to estimate what the runoff potential is in some parts of the Sierra Nevada. Now, I'm not the one running these models and not the expert, but we have partners at the Sierra Nevada Research Institute. And there's good research out of University of Washington and Oregon State with respect to how forest restoration, in some cases, can improve water quantity or at least meter that out over time. We then take some of that estimated value and create an economic analysis based on wildfire risk avoided, as well as the value of that water for the utility. And this was an example of the summary sheet that helped motivate the Yuba Water Agency to contribute $1.5 million towards the $4 million project, with payments though every year of about $300,000 and payments tied to meaningful progress of restoration on the Forest Service land. Trying to find ways for sharing the cost in restoration of our national forests and public lands, I think is essential for helping make sure that there are resources available to do the type of restoration we need to see at scale. And in fact, it makes economic sense. So thank you for the time. I'll stop and wait for questions later, perhaps.
Thank you, Nick. All right, we are now going to hear from our final presenters, Lech Mazinski and Maria Palruggio.
I need to turn my mic on, sorry. So Now we are in. So I'm presenting this in on part of a team, and Maria Paula is going to take over after a little introduction of myself. The project that we are performing right now, that is funded by USDA Forest Service Wood Innovation Grant, has a mouthful of a title: Demonstrating Use and Performance of CLT Modular Building Utilizing Low-Value Pine Lumber from Logs Harvested in Pacific Northwest Forest Restoration Programs. That's the title. And the motivation has been very eloquently essentially presented by my predecessors. What I may dwell on a little bit is why Ponderosa Pine, of all of the species being removed from the restoration programs. And again, this is like preaching to the choir, but it's hard to remove fire from our minds, particularly after this year. It's important to remember that this is not just this year phenomenon. This is like multi-year trend, and it looks like the coming years may be even harder. And the devastation of the local communities was in plain view for everyone. And one of, essentially, you've explained how thinning procedures are one of the means of making forests safer, so that the forest fuel is being removed and the forests are being made sparser, so that the forest fires could look like this, cleaning the forest fuel on the forest floor, but not affecting. Perhaps this is not the best image for the safer fire that may occur. But this is essentially the goal. And we could not help but notice some thinking here. This is the map of fires that recur every year, even though this year it's been, particularly bad. This is the map where Ponderosa Pine is present in the forest. Now, there's nothing magical about Ponderosa Pine, except of all species that are being removed from the forest in the forest restoration project, and of all species that are present in these fire-prone areas, this is one that has relatively low value in terms of structural lumber, and is not being used in structures, essentially. And this last map shows you a distribution of the mass timber panel manufacturing plants, with California eyeing very seriously a possibility of creating conditions for establishing more of manufacturing plants of this type. And so we focused on this Ponderosa pine because mass timber panel industry was originally set up as a means of utilization of low value, low grade lumber, which has been very much overlooked in the discussions, current discussions of the industry. And there is like a pretty good fiber being pushed into this products. This is essentially an industry that can consume, and potentially in large volumes. The volumes will depend on the number of manufacturers in the area, of a lumber like this that does not find a home for itself. Well, there are some people who really like denim lumber, right? But not enough to for the decoration purposes, but not enough to really help in this in removing the fiber in the volumes that are needed. And we thought that the mass timber panel industry that has, in combination with sawmills that have capacity to process small diameter lumber, and there are some within the same region, and one of them actually is producing mass timber panels that would be Wagon in Washington, in the state of Washington. They they may turn the eye on this type of lumber and add value, and if not, certainly not to be a lone solution to the problem, but just contribute to the solution. So this would be an example from Northern Canada, where for very different reasons, Nordic lumber is using small diameter logs for producing CLT and mass timber products. This would be an example of this product. Cross-laminated timber may be produced in many various ways, but may consume substantial volumes of this low-value lumber, both in this, let me highlight this with the laser pointer. The easiest target is the middle layer in here, but this being engineered with product, engineered composite, there is no reason why the entire panel could not be produced from low value material, as long as we understand its properties and the designers can design for these lower properties, right? And we think that in order for the market to gain a volume, the white unicorn CLT buildings that we see in this country right now, I mean, this spectacular tall mass timber projects are not necessarily the best solution. The best solution would be a mass-produced modular CLT system. That would be one that could be in turn used to rebuild devastated communities in terms of affordable housing, or actually starting with emergency housing, community centers, medical centers, affordable housing, you name it, for in communities that have been razed to the ground by forest fires, which means that the fiber being generated in the forest restoration projects could be processed within the same region by the mass timber panel producing industry, assuming that the number of these manufacturers grows, and be used in the same region. And this is what motivated not one, but just a series of big projects of ours, the earliest being in 2015, where we still targeted just small diameter lumber. There is a range that then focused specifically on the Ponderosa Pine, which is the largest volume of fiber that does not find its home, commercial home, in a string of projects that is leading to proving the concept that this fiber, this lumber can be used in meaningful structural composites in meaningful volumes. So this starts in a funny sequence. This is the project that we are actually reporting on, and Maria Paula is going to tell you more about it. This is a preceding project in which we were trying just to define how the product, the panel, can be made. So I'm going to turn it over to Maria Paula.
Yes, thank you. So as Lech mentioned, we had to find a potential market segment for this new engineered wood products, meaning the CLT technique is the same, but the material, the grade of the wood is different, and possibly the mechanical properties. So we thought that again, the possibility to use this CLT more as a sort of off-the-shelf product instead of a custom-made product for unicorn projects was a possibility, and we focused our ideas on modular systems, specifically for transitional shelters. So if you're familiar with different terms used for different types of buildings, depending on the temporal dimension, so let's say the duration of their use from emergency shelters for the immediate use that typically can be used just for a few days, to temporary housing, and so on and so forth. So there is an increasing requirement of for this construction to be robust, to be used for a longer period of time, and possibly to be upgraded for permanent construction, into permanent constructions. So like if you want to just click 4 or 5 times, because there's so we thought that especially the possibility of using CLT for let's say transitional, or something that can become permanent, it's an opportunity to use this material again for something that is not the target TallWood building. It's more a low single story or low rise building for this type of applications. And there are some specific requirements for this type of construction. So next, these requirements are the possibility, first of all, the rapid construction, because especially for housing demands after an emergency, and unfortunately, sadly, we can say that these two ideas of removing Ponderosa Pine to reduce the amount of fuel in the forest and the risk of fire, and the need of rapid shelters in case of emergency can be very much connected. So rapid construction, and also possibility of the construction and reuse for the type of transitional shelter, and also other types of construction that are temporary. The possibility of removing the system and reusing them in a different context, of course, makes the whole system economically viable. Possibility of upgrading, so basically keeping it in the same site, but from a transitional use to a more permanent use. And of course, from a design and production point of view, it has to be cost effective. So off-the-shelf products, off-the-shelf materials, and from a design perspective, some repetitive elements. So it's not a one-of-a-kind design. And but at the same time, the possibility to respond to different demands, different needs, especially with the possibility of upgrading, so flexibility in the design and layout. Next. So we have the usual 3 criteria to consider: cost, quality, and lead time. Most of this type of construction, quality is the least considerate. But considering all these requirements and the possibility to use this material, we thought that a possible viable approach is that defined by the design for manufacturing and assembly. So next. So the criteria defined by this approach is to minimize the number of components and use standard components. And there is also an importance in terms of sustainability, and the use environmental friendly materials and reduce waste. With this approach, we generally deploy solutions that are faster and easier to assembly on site, and most of these the components of the systems are prefabricated, so there is this avoids unnecessary rework and facilitate again the construction on site. with using CLT and mass timber is definitely an option also to design for automation and CNC in production. So next, we played a little bit with some design ideas. These were different combinations of design of different units, different layouts that our internee from the University of Oregon developed for us. But having in mind these criteria that I mentioned of the design for manufacturing and assembly. So we wanted to have to minimize the number of components and have them in a standardized size. And so the concept of modularity is here developed at potentially two scales, but essentially to one important scale that is that of the CLT panel, but potentially also at the scale of the whole unit. So it's basically the concept of the flat pack module with CLT elements that are produced at with the same size, same dimension, instead of one of just customized a customized production for a specific project. And as you may notice, there are some strange elements at the corners and in the connection with the windows. These are special connectors that were identified and produced by one of our partners in the project, Rotoblast. There are special connectors that allow to basically it's sort of plug and play type of connectors. They are pre-installed. A part of them is pre-installed in the factory, already assembled in the panel. Then they are connected simply through bolts on site. So it's a fast and easy connection, and as being an external connection, it allows to be disassembled easily. So we use these criteria for our design and develop. And then there is another important manufacturing based criteria that is in the next slide. So you see here basically the one studio module. These are all the components of the module, and as you can observe, the modularity again is in the dimension of the CLT panels, and specifically the width. Next, there are the important criterion in this case was to use CLT panels produced by one of our manufacturing partners in the project, Wagen. So the press that they use is a vacuum press with a radio frequency system for the adhesive curing, and they had some specific limitations in the width of 4 feet. And this is something that had some, let's say, shortcomings in terms of using the X-rad connectors, because these types of connectors are ideal to connect in whole pieces of wall. So we worked around these limitations to just to see how they could become also opportunities to optimize the design. So currently we are working with our partners, with our industry partners, to make sure that we have an optimized solution in terms of constructability, manufacturability, and hopefully also service life. So we will build and demonstrate this demo unit soon, and we plan to monitor it, so also to have an understanding of its short-term performance at least.
All right, great. Thank you, Marie-Paula and Lek. I'd like to give a quick silent round of applause to all of our presenters. And we're going to open up to questions here. We typically end at 5, but as long as our presenters are here and willing to stay, we'll take questions. And to any of our presenters, if you need to leave at any point, don't be shy. We do have one in the chat room, so if you don't want to ask it directly, you can feel free to put it in chat. So I'll start with the one that is in the chat, and then I'll just open it up to the floor. So I guess this is to Lek and Maria Paula. This is from IKEA and from Finland. And the question is if there's any value that could be added to Ponderosa Pine, I guess in general, considering using thermal modification of Ponderosa Pine. So definitely probably different end uses, but that is the question.
I think there is. I mean, it very much, as you said, Ivan, it very much depends on end use, where and what for the Ponderosa Pine would be used. The thermal modification reduces the ability of the wood to exchange moisture with the environment. So the wood treated that way would be less susceptible to get wet enough to incur any moisture related issues and problems. It does not protect it from fungi specifically, it just reduces its ability to interact with water. In terms of cross-laminated timber and mass timber panels, I have not heard the term treated wood being used extensively. But on the other hand, here the premise would be to use this lumber as minimally processed as possible to make it a relatively inexpensive raw material for this kind of solutions, as opposed to the top quality fiber that's being used for this very visible, as we tend to call it. We are actually all quoting Larry Swan from the VIC program. He calls these projects white unicorns, but for a good reason, right? In this kind of solutions, there is no intent to make the fiber necessarily visible, or they are not going to be standing in place for long enough to incur, or some of them are not going to stand in a place to incur this kind of problems. Or if it happens, it should be very easy in deconstruction, removal, retrofitting, moving to another place to replace any elements that incur any problems. So this is specifically for solutions that do not require, how should I put it, any special treatment, any added value. That's the premise of the project, to just go to the bottom line of this. Does not mean that they do not need to look nice. They can, but not by the whistles and jingles, but rather by pleasing proportion and smart use of modular concept.
Yeah, so I agree, especially, I mean, I don't think that any special treatment served the cause in this case, because we want to have a cost-effective solution. Additionally, one of the possible challenges that we are investigating with our research is the mechanical properties of this CLT, because we know that the material is considered lower grade. So generally, the thermal modification decrease the mechanical properties. And so, in fact, thermal modified wood is used more for non-structural uses. So I don't think this combination of thermally modified wood in any case would be ideal for an engineered wood products used for structural applications, unless there are innovations that in the techniques that I'm not aware of.
I'm going to kind of jump in here. Speaking of thermally modified wood, and this kind of pertains to all the speakers here, I'm wondering if there are any thoughts on, obviously, post-fire utilization of timber. I wonder if there's any thoughts on sort of timing, like how to utilize the timber that's been subjected to fire quickly enough, like what kind of markets exist for charred lumber. Is there like any potential to kind of like, I don't know, is there like a potential for added value for charred lumber in the same way that like denim pine or, the blue stain was once not desirable and then it was sort of rebranded? This kind of speaks to like, is there a market for wood that is very obviously from restoration, and that charred lumber is kind of that stamp of that restoration work? So that's just sort of open-ended.
I'll speak on that real quick. We did a lot of the hazard tree removal and restoration after the Eagle Creek fire along Highway 84 in the gorge. And we ended up with some, gorgeous wood off of that thing. And we were able to sell, I mean, this was on a small scale, but still useful. We were able to sell that wood for boards and for tables and for just a lot of unique thing. And a lot of it was because people had such history with Eagle Creek fire here. They had kind of a masterpiece of their house, whether it was a piece of furniture or a table. So that was successful for our branding. And then, like most of the people know here, the mills right now, the loggers, the landowners are on a big push for the next 12 to 16 months to be able to get as much material out of their ground as possible before the decay starts to happen. And what we normally see after big fire events like this is also a big population of bugs and disease, which even takes out more forest. And the big problem right now that the mills are having is there's no residual value on the chips because of the char. So where the mills start to lose a little bit of money on the lumber value is that they have to do something with all the residual chips coming out of their mills because they're not able to sell those back into the paper market or traditionally what they used to do.
So Lech has a bunch of charred CLT panels in our Oak Creek storage space that we were thinking, okay, we have to use it for probably, for our demonstration unit in some way as external cladding, as a sort of new Shusujiban technique, right? The cherry wood of the Japanese tradition. So why not using also cherry wood from forest fires for this? Of course, it requires some treatment. It's not just charring it. And is Jeff there? Yes, he is there. So Jeff always showed us in our classes that despite charring wood, then there is a way for decay to penetrate the uncharred layer. But it's definitely, in my opinion, an interesting option.
Yeah, I guess the Shoshugiban is kind of a risky one. I wouldn't be pushing it, probably not in Oregon in particular.
Hey, Jeff.
Hey, look, it's good to be we're ahead of you. I'm calling you from the future.
I've noticed. You're always ahead of me.
There we go. Calling you from COVID-free land.
That's definitely the future, not the present.
Yeah, well, we've been living. We haven't had a COVID case in 64 days or something.
Envy.
Yeah.
If there are no questions, I would like to comment on the fabulous synergies that were demonstrated in this talks. We would like to learn from you guys who presented on the economics of removing and of fiber from forests in the restoration programs on logistics of these operations, because this is something that can inform the state of California, who wants to create opportunities for mass timber panel manufacturers. These are relatively small companies, or maybe small companies, and could be distributed over the landscape. But in order to do it properly, there needs to be greater understanding of the logistics of the entire operation that either of us on the team here at OSU have at this point.
It's a great question. One opportunity that we've learned about in our pilots in California, and the Wood Innovation Grant is for Region 5. We also have ongoing projects in Southern Oregon, in the Rogue River Siskiyou, and up in Mount Baker, Snoqualmie, and Okanagan, Wenatchee that we're developing. The Forest Service has, on some forests, 40 or 50% vacancy. Like, they have jobs and they have a hiring freeze, and they have jobs that are open that they can't hire for. So imagine working in that environment would be really, really tough, especially when taking on a bigger vision for restoration that I think we all want to see. One opportunity through implementation partners, that's the jargon we're using, at least, for partners of the Forest Service which are often nonprofits or tribal entities, or counties, governments that can use a master stewardship agreement or a good neighbor authority from the state, can with that type of mechanism provide supply guarantees. So if you are looking to invest in infrastructure, and depending on the next 10, 15, 20 years of small diameter biomass, with landscape scale projects that can be financed or having funding certainty, but we think financing can provide that certainty, the implementer can provide that supply guarantee. The Forest Service is not allowed to provide supply guarantees currently. And I think people are working on that too, and as they should, if possible. But the supply for CLT and other types of infrastructure, the investments in the facilities to utilize that biomass really needs to have a certainty of fuel or of supply, and nonprofit implementation partners can provide that.
So this is excellent. What we are trying to do is mostly on the side of technical feasibility, that you can actually technically do it. But it would be great for us to partner, or at least have a longer conversation with people like you guys who understand the economics of this, both from the business side as Paul, and both from the Forest Service side. That would provide us with more complete, more holistic vision of what is possible, what is not.
Nick, I'm curious, in terms of the investments that come in, because I mean, this is basically kind of like social, ecological investment, right?
Yeah, sort of.
In a way,
it gets marketed that way initially, but if you talk to most, even the impact investors like Calvert Impact Capital, they would rather we talk about this as a market rate investment. So with lack of time, I didn't share the $4 million project has 4 different investors, 2 of whom are foundations making something called program related investments. Those are by definition below market rate loans if the IRS is to approve of. Foundations, as most probably know, have to give away a certain percent, at least 5% of their endowment every year. One might call it a tax loophole, one might just call it a manner of public policy that we've established this for many, many years, that foundations can count towards their 5%, making loans as long as they are below market rate and they're towards a public interest, a public good. And that's called a program related investment. And you're able to take it. One could think about that as like on a small scale, things that the states do with a clean water revolving fund. So those are 0 and 1% loans that can provide very low interest capital. ultimately people think if we can provide a market rate of return on these investments, then it's actually going to grow. And most people, rather, you can market to the sustainable investing group, and there's a growing need for that and a growing interest in that, and that's exciting. But where this really takes off is where you have a pension fund saying, man, that is some good diversification in our portfolio to have a solid 4% return. It's not the highest of returns, but a pension fund has some money in venture capital with investors, has money in all sorts of different asset classes. And this is a very good type of asset class that doesn't correlate with anything else in the market. And that, not when it doesn't correlate with anything else, investors think, wow, that is good. That is helpful to me, as long as it's of low risk in and of itself. And once we can be that compelling rate of return, you're going to have a lot of other investors saying, I don't even care if this is sustainable investing. This is where I want to put some of my money. And when you do that, that's when this takes off. So our goal is to try and make this as boring and as routine, and even to talk to folks that are familiar with infrastructure investing and say, this is just an extension of what we've been doing for years. Because once it's familiar and comfortable, more money is going to flow, and then larger projects are going to be possible. We just have to find a way to pay back these projects. But with a very low interest rate loan, if you can make the benefits that would accrue from that work happen, which are 10, 15, 20 years of fire resiliency, and you can pay for a lot of things when you have a 1 or 2% interest rate, in other words.
Thanks.
So tell me, with tying the utilization of the fiber that is being generated in the forest restoration to the reconstruction after the fire devastation, and to in the local economy, and essentially not in a terribly expensive type of manufacturing facilities. The modest size CLT manufacturing plant may cost 15 to 20 something million, right? It's like everything new. If you start as a sawmill, this may be substantially less. If you start as a glulam manufacturer, it may be even less. So these are not terribly expensive propositions, and the manufacturers are not going to be tied to the restoration fiber should the source ever dry out or become problematic for any reasons. So there are aspects of this that make this proposition as a business model more resilient, and it's not a commodity product. It's specialty product, right? The CLT manufacturers, essentially, they produce buildings. They do not produce panels. They produce buildings. So there's like somewhat different economics for this type of operation as well. And I wonder if this could translate into some more robust, more appetizing model of funding for this avenue of utilization. I'm not saying as the only solution to this, but as a component of a solution.
Yeah, I'd love to say just a couple more words, and then perhaps Paul or others can share. If one thinks about fair trade coffee or fair trade cotton or whatever, those are good labeling mechanisms that can help drive a smaller or an increase in the margin or the premium that folks are willing to pay for. And that's, I think, definitely part of the solution for this. We are trying to look at, I think, complementary to that, the whole economic environment, and to think, well, what does an entity need to make that $20 million investment in a CLT facility? Is that certainty of supply, or is that a certainty of a market to sell into, or a premium for the product that they're making? And a holistic approach like a forest resilience bond can try and vertically integrate without actually vertically integrating the company into single ownership. It's trying to help internalize some of the different benefits that would come from this that folks are willing to pay for, but structure the agreements and contracts through a collaborative financing mechanism to help it all get paid for. So if you had, my question might be back to the CLT manufacturer, is there already groups willing to pay a premium for the fire risk reduction? If not, a mechanism like Blue Forest is doing, or labeling with Sustainable Northwest and the collaboration that Sustainable Northwest is already facilitating, might help introduce folks that are willing to pay for that co-benefit with the forest product as well. So finding where the bottleneck is the system solution I have a question about.
So this is our bet in conceptualizing a mechanism where the communities that are either affected by forest fires or maybe in risks of being affected to forest fires that have definitely the stakes in it, and the state of California, who has at the same time a very costly fire problem and apartment shortage, right, housing shortage problem. They may see it as a tool that may be used to fix a couple problems at the same time.
Absolutely. And conservation finance, in my opinion, is one of the jargony words for what we're trying to work on. It doesn't operate without policy too. It doesn't operate in a vacuum. When we're trying to think about how do we value risk reduction in fire, how do we value increased in housing affordability and housing access, especially in really good places to live in that are made out of wood and healthy, and those go hand in hand with policy. So where are their subsidies? Where are their costs? Where is there an even playing field so that the things that are valued, there's actually a mechanism for those parties to help pay for? Now in California, there is a subsidy for wood that I don't know if it's helping the projects pencil out, but for bioenergy facilities that are utilizing wood that's coming from high fire prone areas. And they can make about 3 times the normal value for the energy they produce if it's wood that has come from certain areas that have been identified as high fire prone, whether it's national forest or regular. That's an example of a policy that helps internalize something that the state has said, we care about this. Let's figure out how to subsidize the things that we care about and tax the things that we want to discourage. And for conservation finance, I mean, that can get sort of nasty on a lot of levels, perhaps, and I'm not, but I'm still a proponent of things like air pollution, things like wildfire risk. I mean, perhaps homeowner associations, perhaps insurance companies would be the conduit to approach, but no one party wants to be paying for the whole thing themselves. And so some way to facilitate, there's, again, like Sustainable Northwest has facilitated amazing collaboration for planning projects. That type of mechanism has been motivating for us to think of how can the economics and financing be facilitated through collaboration as well. I don't think we have the answer yet at Blue Forest, but I think it's a part of the solution and going to need collaboration in and of itself for that too. So.
This is exactly the kind of understanding that we are missing, and we would gladly engage in longer term discussion outside of even of this meeting on
Wonderful.
We know about this kind of industry and how this could play to this kind of policies. We know one side of this, you know the other side of this, and Paul knows the yet another side of this, and another Paul knows yet another side of it. And all this together pieced, puzzle-like may provide the state or other entity that can issue a policy a little easier to cross the Rubicon and say, yes, this is what we are going to do.
I think my personal opinion to look for mass quantities of pine is you're gonna have an easier approach looking to the to the east of the Cascades than trying to be down in the California business market, environmental market down there, and trying to get past Sierra Pacific Industries is a very tough nut to crack down there. And there's, plenty of pine that's available that everybody's scratching their head to do with it. Here at our local mill, they take pine wood that they've done it for years and years and years. And I was just talking to the president the other day, and they still think the best value for their pine is they put it in, they use it for peeler core, and they put it into their plywood. And that's where their older Ponderosa pine goes to. Kind of, it's almost like a CLT product, but it just that's where they go to. California identified 2 years ago that they had 150 million trees across their landscape that was dead, and they said okay. And so it's a very, very, very tough market to kind of move the needle in down there, in my opinion. And I've lived in that market before, compared to Washington and Oregon, where it seems like you can kind of move things along a little quicker than down there. And that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think you're right. We're hoping on the Rogue River Siskiyou that there'll be a good chance, as well as in the Okanagan. So, I mean, Vaughan is a real leader too in some of the small diameter uses, and your work too. I think there's a really good experience in the Northwest for small diameter use.
I maybe have one last question. I wanted to get Paul Vanderfort here to maybe speak a little bit to the narrative side of things, because there's also obviously sort of a storytelling in this transparency component. So I'm wondering, if you have any thoughts on sort of what's been spoken about in terms of branding of restoration products and what roles that might play. I was thinking, is there any way to sort of tie a built landscape to a forest that was managed for restoration, sort of reinforcing that public narrative that our buildings can stem from these forests that actively need work? Or just wanted to hear your voice a little bit on this.
Sure, thanks. I would say that there's a few thoughts that I have based on the conversation. One is that there's so much of a disconnect between the restoration work that happens on the ground and anybody that buys wood. That just doesn't, there's not, I mean, the federal forest collaborative groups, the forest collaborative groups that are operating on other landscapes, when you talk about what does the market look like, I mean, most of the time they're just trying to get zones of agreement, get projects on the ground, get the projects done. It's not really about market, right? And for the mills involved, I think it's really about the security of log volume. And so, that's an interesting nexus, because I think fire really presents a risk for security. And I think stewardship really creates some stability, both in terms of lowering the fire risk, but also we've seen mills like in John Day where the security of a 10-year stewardship contract helps retool to better take advantage of small diameter. So I think that there is a log security piece here that's more critical probably on the ground. But when it comes to market, I mean, I'm not saying that small diameter is always low value, but there are low margins. So even a very modest market recognition and market traction for a product, I think can go a long way, particularly in moving the needle on product that mills are trying to figure out, is this viable, right? I mean, you see Vaughan sometimes being the only bidder on restoration harvest, and there's a risk there, right? And so if their utilization model is working, that's great. But even if we can bump it a little bit, somebody mentioned earlier about all of the landscapes we already have NEPA done on. Not all of those are going to have saw logs, but the more we can bump the market component here, I think I don't want to go down the slippery slope of saying we're going to be able to cut our way through all of the restoration goals that we have, but I think that there is a slice of that pie that could be moved with some market traction. So that's definitely what I'm hoping to do. I mean, when I take tech firms who are building massive mass timber buildings and getting a lot of visibility, and we bring them onto the landscape, and their backyards are burning and their sky is orange, they're writing wood policy saying that that's what we want. And, I think looking at that map that was shared of the lack of infrastructure for mass timber in California, I think that was a really interesting map for me. I certainly have pretty good awareness of the mass timber infrastructure in Oregon and Washington, but I don't have a good read on California. So that's an interesting one. But I think luckily a lot of these projects have tiers, right? They'll have a baseline tier of what they want to see at a very minimum. And we're getting restoration in there somewhere on their kind of baseline or next up tier. And, part of that tier is just a North American wood sourcing tier. So I think, somebody in California is going to preference wood from California, but if the only mass timber available is in Oregon or Washington, that certainly still fits within their broader goals. So I think we're going to be able to start making have some successes, have some projects, bring in some restoration wood that might be from out of state, but within region. And then as milling infrastructure develops, or perhaps because of some additional market demand, somebody might make an investment and then we'll start being able to do it within state. But I think right now we're talking about region and people are pretty open to that. I'd love for the market work that we're doing to have impact on really expanding that infrastructure. But, I definitely don't, I'm skeptical that even if I have massively wild success with our markets work, that I'll be moving the needle in a major way, at least for anybody, and choosing to invest in. But if we can earn social license and we can get some log supply guarantees, I think that probably changes things more, to be honest. So, I think Sustainable Northwest's work kind of attacks it from both sides. Like, how do we just get these projects running? How do we get some of these marketable materials into mills? And then also, once it's there, how are we going to tether that to market? And I think that second one, that question's not really been asked. And so, I think even a little bit of traction is got me excited. And, there's some pretty big projects underway right now with millions of board feet of mass timber in them. And so, in a few years, I think we will have something to look at and really use as a model.
Really interesting. Very, very interesting. I want to ask Charles Toombs, do you have a question? I noticed you turned your video on a little while ago.
Yes, and I apologize. I was late to the meeting, and because I had another meeting going, and I was hard to sign in. I'm following. I'm in the College of Business, and I'm trying to follow this very carefully. We've actually got a course that's being this winter. That's a combination course between the College of Business and the College of Forestry, because we're looking at this Willamette Valley Ponderosa Pine as an opportunity rather than a problem. And one of the ways we're trying to do it, and again, I'm new to the forestry end, and I'm new to the mills issues, economic issues, and I'm trying to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. So I'm not fully informed at this point. But one of the things we did in the spring is we did this in a normal class, and what we did is I understand the Ponderosa. What we're trying to do is we're trying to flip it into. You talk about the markets, and what we're trying to do is flip it into. Take a marginal wood, okay, a marginal wood that was planted, and the result of the fact that they planted this Willamette Valley Ponderosa Pine was because it was marginal soil, and it was the only thing that they couldn't plant Douglas fir, and that grew, and now they're trying to find a market for this stuff. And the way I'm looking at this thing is flipping it around and creating a premium product out of it, from the standpoint that if we can put the timber people in the position that they were visionaries in being able to plant this product where no Douglas fir grew, then we can claim that we're better stewards of our environment. And at that point, we can create value in that wood. And to substantiate that, we had a class, and I got 3 or 4 executives at Home Depot that I know from a previous life, if you will, and they joined this class virtually, and they loved the idea. So what I'm trying to figure out is trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together so that we can take this marginal wood and create not only solve the problem, but create a premium product out of it. And to the extent that if we went, and this is one thing we're going to encourage the student, we've created this class and we're going to actually encourage the students to, and we've got Home Depot to buy into this, and to go out to Home Depot and find everything that Home Depot sells that's made of plastic. And we're going to go and then we're going to make it out of wood. And then we're going to sell it at a premium, and we're going to sell them on this idea of this. And that puts a lot of pressure on a lot of things, right? It puts a lot of pressure on the mill because the mill has certain considerations. It puts a lot of pressure on design, but we've got Phil Mann and some other people trying to design it. But then we've got to sell the value proposition. And that's what we're trying to do, is put all those pieces of the puzzle together so that we can do this. And it's sort of, I guess what I'm thinking is it's aligning all the economic incentives on the supply chain together so that we turn it into a positive. Because I think that the timber people in Oregon, and I'm sure it's the same in California, have been just reacting over the last 40 years. They're not, it's not proactive. And I think if you go to the market and say, whether or not we really were visionaries, I mean, they had empty land and they planted something. And let's turn it into the fact that, and I'm in Oregon, so I mean, we could sell the idea that, Oregon's visionary, we use our land properly, we're doing it this way. And guess what? Instead of buying a styrofoam cooler, buy a Ponderosa Pine cooler. But then that, again, that puts pressure on a couple areas. It forces the designer and it forces the mill to get in track. However, one of the advantages of this damn Zoom thing in the pandemic is I was able to get tons of guest speakers in. I had Home Depot in and Lowe's, and these guys are coming in. These are lumber buyers. And I had we had mills. We had mills in, and we had mills that hate Home Depot, and we had you get the supply chain in the same room, and all of a sudden, Home Depot. I made the comment. I said, well, do you guys, if you guys like a product, do you think you could get a mill to work with you? And he laughed at me. He said, oh, they've put mills out of business and they've created mills. So the point that and again, I'm approaching this as an uninformed. I'm more informed than I was 3 months ago, but I'm missing 60% of all the equations. But the point that I'm making is we turn this into a opportunity value proposition, and the market is ready for this. These millennials and these kids, they don't want to buy a styrofoam cooler. They want to, but can we make a cooler and sell it for $9.95 or whatever we have to sell it for? And then what does that mean? And I can tell you one other subject was, I was with one of the timber people, and I was up in the and I was riding in one of the expensive machines that goes and picks it and does all that stuff. And they had two piles. They had the one pile that was going to go to the mill where they were going to get the money for it. And then they had another pile that was 3 times the size that was going to get chips made out of it. And you go, well, and I'm going, this is I'm riding around in a $750,000 machine. And I'm going, this is a lot of work and a lot of capital to 2/3 of your volume is no margin. And I'm going, this really doesn't make any sense to me, And so I'm thinking so my goal is to disrupt the whole thing, piss off a lot of people and see where it lands, and I think that's kind of that's why I'm trying to learn. And I apologize for getting late to the meeting because I was stacked up and I had a hard time signing in, but that's my
that's totally fine. I think what you're speaking to is that there's an important component of the narrative or the spin that can be put on products. It's like what I brought.
I mean, it's exactly what they did with blue stained pine, right? The mills don't want it. They turn around. Now all of a sudden it's denim pine, it's this pine, and it's hard to find. Right. One of the things with pine is, it does have in the mills, it's hard to dry, it's hard to kiln dry. So there's that part of it. But what I've always talked to Russ Vaughan about is it's the Portlandia show, right? Like It's that chicken episode. Where did my chicken come from? What's its name? What kind of life did it have? Where did it eat, right?
Right.
And so I've always thought to have that whole entire thing through the timber industry. This is the block of trees where my trees came from. They're sustainably harvested. We never hurt them.
Right.
Here's the mill that it went through,
Right.
and they were touched properly. And then now they're put into your house, and you have the whole story of when the tree was planted, what year, how it was harvested, and here, and it's that narrative story, right?
Right.
And so,
And this isn't, and this is a tree that was planted in rejected soil.
yeah, and so I mean,
This is a third world tree.
yeah, no, I mean, that's my whole entire theory with the mass timber and all that kind of
Right.
stuff. And these
Right.
mass builders be like,
And then
it's
here's
not the
other
building,
thing.
it's the story, right?
Right,
Like,
and then the other thing is, then you flip it around where all of a sudden what happened, and I don't know 1,000 board feet or however you guys label this industry, but assume that then if you could create a small niche market where you're actually making more money on a board foot basis than you are on Douglas fir, what happens then?
yeah,
Think
and
about
it
that.
being-
What
yeah,
then? What? Whoa! Because everybody looks at their checkbook, right? And they go, and then the mill. I get the mill's idea about, we want a Douglas fir, and it's got to be this size, and it's got to go this because we're set up to do this. And I'm going, yeah. So was Henry Ford in the 1930s, right? That was his approach, So the mill's got a lot of problems too. I mean, they got to figure this out as well. So, maybe that means other kinds of mills, or I don't know, but I don't know enough about the business yet. But to me, the market is ready for a tailor-made, sustainable wood. And the other thing is the timber people have, they've been beaten to death about this whole sustainability issue. And I'm going, you guys are growing trees. I mean, what the hell? And I'm going, the narrative needs to be flipped back around. And I think you could take a niche product like this Willamette Valley Ponderosa Pine, and you can make a fortune. Everybody could make a fortune selling this
yeah,
stuff.
it comes down to branding. It comes down to,
And I can tell you, we had the head buyer from the timber buyer from Home Depot. He's actually from Lapine, or he's from Eastern Oregon, and he's just going, and he goes, the thing is, guys, there's so little volume there, we could blow through it in a weekend. If they just align the supply chain. And what would you do? I mean, that's the kind of thing. Then you go, and then there's, I don't know how many people are with OSU here, but okay, James Watson is a colleague of mine, and Damian Hamel. These guys have cooked up this thing where they can actually predict the changing soil conditions. So we could actually then say, well, this is how much we'll allocate for this valuable wood in the future. Then we start selling futures contracts to Lowe's and Home Depot and making them compete for Ponderosa pine that's 40 years from now that they can't get any other way. You know what I mean? And I think if you do it that way, then people are going, because the guys, they want a cooler and they don't want to buy it out of styrofoam. Right?
Yeah, I think we got to we got to get going here.
Oh,
guys.
sorry. Yeah.
We're going to save this for another conversation, but obviously more to talk about. So thank you, everybody who's remaining, for engaging in the conversation. And thank you to our speakers who
Great to
remain.
meet y'all.
Nice.
We'd love to be in touch if you have interest.
Yeah, let's continue the
Yes,
conversation.
let's continue this conversation, please.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. Bye-bye.
All right. See ya.